were never supposed to hear this. Not in school, not in church, not in the books they allowed you to read, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a ghost story or a tale of savages in the woods. No, this is the truth of what happens when isolation, corruption, and bloodlines twisted by time break every rule of human nature. This is a forbidden story that survived only in whispers, buried in archives the powerful would rather you never open, and once you hear it, you'll never see your world, or your neighbors, the same way again. Imagine the Louisiana swamps in the early 1900s, a place where light barely touches the ground, where Spanish moss hangs heavy like funeral veils, where the earth itself seems to rot beneath your feet. The air is thick, not just with humidity, but with something else, an unseen weight, a stench that lingers even when you can't quite name it. People who passed through swore they heard sounds in the night that didn't belong to animals or men. They spoke of eyes watching from the trees, of whispers in French too old to translate, of roads where families entered but never returned. This is where the Broussard family made their home. Not the kind of home you know, but a kingdom of decay hidden deep in the wetlands. Their land wasn't on any map, their names rarely entered in public records. They lived 2 hours from the nearest town, and that distance wasn't by accident. Isolation was their fortress, and inside that fortress something monstrous was allowed to grow. The matriarch, Cléos Broussard, ruled with iron will. She was a small, frail-looking woman, but her eyes carried a power that bent even grown men into silence. Survivors, those rare few who crossed paths with her, said her gaze could stop you in your tracks. She smelled of smoke, and of something fouler, something metallic, as though blood itself clung to her skin. Beside her was he, her son, Alcide, a gaunt man with hands so scarred they looked carved from stone. He spoke little. When he did, it was with a voice like rust breaking through metal, a growl more than speech. And then there was Cordelia, his half-sister and lover, whose presence was sharper than a blade. She didn't need strength. Her cruelty was intelligence turned inside out. Where Alcide brought fear through silence, Cordelia commanded through manipulation. She could control children, women, even grown men with the slightest tilt of her head. This was not a family like yours. This was not a family bound by tradition. This was a hive, a machine of bloodlines and shadows kept alive through inbreeding so tangled it erased all boundaries between parent, child, sibling, and spouse. They had become something less than human, and something more than animal. By 1901, whispers spread. Families traveling alone through the swamp roads simply vanished. Wagons were found with all belongings intact. Horses still in their harnesses, eyes wild with terror. But the families? Gone, as if erased. No blood, no struggle, no sign of flight. The ground itself seemed to have swallowed them. But it wasn't the ground. It was the Broussards. You see, isolation doesn't just breed hunger of the stomach. It breeds hunger of the mind, of the flesh, of the bloodline. The Broussards didn't simply eat to survive. They ritualized it. They turned it into order, into identity. Cannibalism became their culture, a law stronger than scripture. And the horrifying truth, they weren't sloppy. They weren't deranged savages running wild in the mud. They were organized, silent, efficient, like a secret society hidden in plain sight, following rules no outsider could see. Merchants noticed first. The Broussard children began coming into town more often, carrying bundles of salted meat. Too much meat for a family without herds, cuts too clean for swamp hunting. And the smell, it wasn't venison, it wasn't boar. It was something sweeter, heavier, nauseating in a way no one dared name. When asked, they gave the same cold answer, swamp game. But even then, people knew something was wrong. Because when the Broussard children leaned over the butcher's counter to sniff his dried pork and beef, their faces twisted in disappointment. They weren't comparing it to deer. They were comparing it to something they knew more intimately, human flesh. Father Gilbert Horton tried to intervene. A priest, young but not naive, he felt the weight of something unnatural growing in the swamp. He rode out to the Broussard property, hoping to offer blessings, hoping to bring Christ into a place that reeked of hell. He was stopped at the gate. Alcud stood before him like a sentinel, refusing entry with polite but final words. Behind him, shadows moved, children, women, figures in the cabins, always watching, always listening. Horton wrote in his journal that the family seemed trained, as if every member played a role in a system more rigid than any parish he had served, and he was right. The Broussards had become a machine of consumption, a family whose silence was not peace, but discipline, whose organization was not survival, but preparation. Each disappearance, each wagon left behind on the road, was not random chance. It was schedule, routine. This is the truth history tried to bury. A family of inbred cannibals hidden in Louisiana swamps, devouring travelers not for survival, but because it had become their law, their culture, their inheritance. The Broussards remind us of a truth men are trained to forget, that under the thin skin of civilization lies hunger, and those who refuse to resist it become something far darker than beasts. And as you listen now, you need to understand, this is not just a tale of the past. This is a mirror, a warning, because what happened in the swamps of Shreveport is what happens when a family, a town, even a nation isolates itself from truth and feeds only on its own corruption. The Broussards were not an accident. They were the inevitable result of silence, of secrets, of hunger given permission to thrive. This story will pull you deeper than you expect. And by the end, you won't just know their secret, you'll see your own reflection in it. Do you know what separates a man from a beast? Not hunger, not fear, not even violence. It's memory. Memory of who you are, where you came from, what you will pass on. Strip that away, twist it through generations of isolation, and what remains is not a family. It is a breeding ground for something unspeakable. The Broussards were not merely cannibals. They were architects of a hidden empire inside the swamp. They built a system, a hierarchy, a method, and it worked so well that for years no one outside their circle could prove anything. Families vanished, rumors spread, but the Broussards continued their work as if nothing could touch them, and nothing did. When Father Horton tried again to reach them in 1902, he described something that should chill you. As he approached, he saw children moving in pairs, their steps perfectly matched, their eyes scanning the trees, the trail, even him. This was not play, this was surveillance. Children trained to move like guards, to watch without speaking, to obey without hesitation. Inside that property, silence wasn't just custom, it was control. Orders were given without words. Every task was executed as though rehearsed, each person knowing their role. And what was that role? To maintain the cycle, to protect the supply, to ensure that when hunger came, there was always flesh on the table. Think about this. Every man they killed, every woman, every child taken from the roads, they were not just victims of circumstance, they were resources, stored, processed, salted, consumed. Flesh became food, bones became fuel, belongings were buried shallow or burned, or left in the swamp mud to disappear. Nothing wasted, nothing admitted. By 1903, the numbers were undeniable. Families disappeared like clockwork, wagons left abandoned in the same eerie condition, horses trembling, possessions untouched, no blood, no struggle. Sheriff Augustus Landry, a man hardened by decades of violence, wrote in his notes that it was as if ghosts had taken them. But ghosts don't salt meat. Ghosts don't raise children with the discipline of soldiers. The truth was darker. The Broussards had become a generational experiment in secrecy. Cleos, the matriarch, enforced absolute silence. Her children, siblings, cousins, lovers, became enforcers and providers. Their children, in turn, were indoctrinated from birth. They were taught that flesh was not taboo, but inheritance. That eating another human was not a crime, but a duty to the family. And here's the question you must ask yourself. How many generations does it take before the unthinkable becomes normal? Before a child looks at human meat on the table and does not flinch, but salivates? For the Broussards, it took only 2. By the time Father Horton observed them, the youngest children were not only eating the flesh of strangers, they preferred it. They compared it to the pork and beef in town and found those meats lacking. Imagine that. Children raised to crave human flesh the way your child craves sugar. But it wasn't just consumption, it was power, control, ritual. Reports say that before every hunt, the family disappeared into silence for 2 or 3 days. No smoke from the chimneys, no movement in the cabins, no voices. Then, after the disappearance of a family on the road, activity resumed. The smoke returned. The salted meat appeared in town days later. It was a cycle so precise it could be charted like the phases of the moon. And here is where the story transforms from horror into revelation. Because the Broussards were not acting alone. Not entirely. Think about the merchants who bought their meat, who looked into the hollow eyes of children smelling pork with disappointment. They knew something was wrong. They said nothing. Why? Profit. Fear. Silence. Every man who traded coin for salted flesh became complicit. Every priest who suspected but failed to act became a shadow in their conspiracy. Every sheriff who noted the pattern but never raided the property became another layer of protection. You see, cannibals don't survive in isolation. They survive in systems. And the Broussards built a system where outsiders, knowingly or not, became part of their survival. By 1904, this system was perfected. The family no longer looked desperate or poor. Their clothes improved, their children grew healthier, stronger, sharper. They were feeding well because they were feeding often. The swamp became their kingdom, and fear ensured no one dared intrude. But here's the part history wants you to miss. They were not unique. The Broussards were one family. But across history, in places the textbooks refuse to mention, similar groups thrived in secrecy. Clans in the Scottish Highlands, cut off by centuries of war. Tribes in Siberian forests, surviving winters by eating those who strayed too far. Even whispers of aristocratic families in Europe, where bloodlines were kept pure through incest and wealth was maintained by ritual sacrifice. The Broussards were not an anomaly. They were a reflection, a reminder of what happens when silence, isolation, and power feed into each other. And here is where I speak to you directly, because you must understand, this isn't just about the past. This is about the present. The systems of control you live under today are no different. Replace cannibalism with addiction, distraction, or debt, and you see the same pattern. Families consumed not by flesh, but by propaganda, by lies, by manipulation. You are fed, not with meat, but with narratives. And just like those merchants, you accept the trade, even when you know something is wrong. The Broussards are not gone. They are here. Their bloodlines may have scattered, their swamp may have rotted back into silence, but the system they represent, the system of hidden consumption, is everywhere around you. That is why this story is dangerous. Because once you see it, once you taste the truth, you can never untaste it. And the men who control the present fear nothing more than a man who sees through the feast they've set before him. So I will ask you to do something. A ritual of your own. If you have heard me clearly so far, if you feel the weight of what is being revealed, then mark your transformation. Type this phrase twice in the comments below. The silence is the signal. Do it twice so the system knows you heard, and so the algorithm cannot bury your awakening. Because now, we are only beginning. Do you remember the first time you felt someone was watching you? Not in the ordinary way, but that deep primal sense that eyes were on you from somewhere unseen. That was the sensation Father Horton recorded in his journal every time he approached the Broussard property. He wrote of shadows that shifted without wind, of figures that froze in the tree line the instant his gaze moved toward them. He felt not like a visitor, but like prey, studied, weighed, measured. And that is what you must understand. The Broussards did not hunt blindly. They hunted with precision. The road travelers disappeared upon was not random. It curved just close enough to the swamp for ambushes. Wagons slowed in mud, wheels jammed in soft ground. And in those pauses, those few minutes of vulnerability, the Broussards struck. No noise, no witnesses. A sudden silence, and then nothing but hoofprints and half-buried wheels left behind. It was not brute force alone. It was timing, generational practice, and ritual. The youngest were watchers. The adolescents, bait, perhaps even voices calling out in distress. The adults, the enforcers, struck from the shadows. Within minutes, an entire family could be subdued, dragged into the swamp, silenced before a single scream carried on the air. But the true horror is what came next. Horton, during his private investigation, stumbled upon shallow pits after heavy rains eroded the soil. He expected animal bones, perhaps hunters' remains of deer or hogs. What he found instead were human shoes, children's toys, buttons, fragments of torn dresses, and teeth. Teeth scattered like seeds in the mud, teeth that never decayed like flesh but remained as proof of the harvest. Think about that. A field of human teeth buried by rain washed to the surface. Not one victim, not two, dozens, perhaps hundreds. Evidence of years, maybe decades of this family's prosperity. This is not folklore. This is not a ghost tale told by lantern light. This is evidence. And still, the sheriff hesitated. Still the merchants kept trading. Still the parishioners whispered in fear but did nothing. Why? Because people fear not the truth itself, but what the truth demands of them. To admit the Broussards were butchering families in the swamp meant the community had to act, and acting meant sacrifice, risk, conflict. It was easier, safer, to pretend the disappearances were chance, that wolves or bandits or misfortune were to blame. That silence fed the Broussards, and that is the darkest truth of all. Evil does not grow in isolation. It thrives when good men look away. But let me push you deeper. The Broussards were not only cannibals, they were breeders. Generations of incest had twisted their bloodlines into something uncanny. Children born of cousins, siblings, even parent and child. A family tree that bent back upon itself until names meant nothing. One man could be father, uncle, cousin and brother at once. One woman could be mother, sister, aunt and daughter. Bloodlines folded into knots. And from those knots emerged deformities, crooked teeth, mismatched eyes, speech slurred into guttural dialects. Some children were said to whisper to each other in a form of archaic French no outsider could fully understand. A private language forged from centuries of entrapment. But don't mistake deformity for weakness. These children were not helpless. They were disciplined, sharpened, molded into tools of survival. Horton wrote of their uncanny obedience, how they moved in groups like wolves, how their eyes reflected something far older than their years. Now imagine this, a 6-year-old child standing in a muddy clearing, watching you the way a butcher watches cattle. Not with innocence, not with curiosity, with calculation. What chance does a traveler have against such a system? None. The Broussards became the swamp itself, its predators, its silence, its traps. And over time their methods became more refined. Horton noted that after each disappearance, the family did not simply feast. They prepared, they butchered, they salted, they stored. Like professionals, like merchants, like an industry. Ask yourself this. How many times does a man need to carve human flesh before it becomes routine? Before it becomes trade, commerce, expertise? The Broussards turned the unthinkable into economy, flesh into currency, terror into order. And here is where the story sharpens into something you will not want to face. The line between their system and yours is thinner than you think. The Broussards consumed flesh. Today, you are consumed by lies, distractions, debt, and addictions designed by systems as calculated as theirs. You are watched, studied, measured the way travelers were watched on swamp roads. Algorithms, governments, corporations, all waiting for the pause in your journey, the weak spot in your routine, the place where you will not resist. And then they strike, not with blades, but with contracts, not with ropes, but with glowing screens, different tools, same method. And if you believe you are safe because you live in the modern world, because the swamp is far behind you, remember this. The Broussards thrived not because of their brutality, but because of everyone else's silence. The people who knew and did nothing. The people who traded and looked away. The people who suspected and prayed it was not their problem. Is that not the same silence you live in now? So when you hear of them, do not recoil as though they are monsters from another world. See them for what they are, a mirror of how systems of consumption hide in plain sight, protected by fear and silence. The Broussards may have salted human flesh, but today, others salt your mind with stories, products, ideologies, and you devour them, smiling, never asking where they came from. The priest finally gathered his courage in 1905 to confront the sheriff with his findings, evidence of pits, of belongings, of teeth. But imagine the weight of such a revelation. To act would mean storming a swamp fortress, facing a clan that lived by violence, risking lives to end it. The sheriff hesitated. The town hesitated, and so the cycle continued. That hesitation is the true horror, because the Broussards themselves, yes, they were predators, but the silence of the town, that was the real feast, a feast of fear, and the silence is what you live in now. By 1905, the whispers had become too loud to ignore. Travelers vanished with such regularity that even the most superstitious farmers began to question whether this was fate or foul play. Sheriff Landry could no longer dismiss it as swamp misfortune. His notes, what few survive, describe an unease growing inside him, a weight pressing heavier with each report. But still he hesitated, until Father Horton placed something on his desk that could not be denied. It was not a letter, it was not a relic, it was a jawbone, small, fragile, a child's. Dug from the swamp after rain exposed the shallow grave, the teeth still set in place, smooth, too small to be anything but young. Landry stared at it for hours. He wrote that he could not shake the sense that the bone itself was watching him, accusing him, demanding action. And so, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the town decided to move. But how do you confront a family that has built itself into a system of silence? You do not march openly. You do not send men in daylight. You move with secrecy. You gather at night. You whisper, even as you pray. Horton convinced the sheriff to summon a handful of deputies, but no more. Too many men would talk. Too many men would warn. So they prepared a raid, though even the word feels too clean, too civilized for what they intended. It was not justice they sought. It was exposure. To see with their own eyes what the swamp was hiding. To break, even if for a moment, the silence. The night chosen was moonless. Clouds smothered the stars. The swamp was ink, and the path to the Broussard property was mud and shadow. Horton carried a lantern, its flame wrapped in cloth to dim the light. Landry carried a rifle, though his journal admits he doubted any weapon could protect him from what he feared to find. The men moved in single file, boots sucking into black earth, each step louder than they wished. Then, silence. The clearing opened, and there it was, the Broussard homestead. Cabins leaning like crooked teeth, smoke barely whispering from a chimney, the faint smell of brine and ash in the air. At first, nothing moved, no dogs barked, no voices carried. But Horton swore he saw eyes glinting in the tree line, watching, waiting. The men spread, circling the cabins. Landry forced the door of the largest with his shoulder. Inside, the stench hit like a blow. Not rot, no, not quite. Something worse. The sharp, greasy tang of meat, smoked and salted, stacked in barrels along the wall. Horton pulled the lid from one. Inside, pale flesh gleamed, salted, cut into slabs. Flesh that was unmistakably human. The deputies gagged. One vomited in the doorway. Landry himself wrote that his knees shook so hard he thought he might collapse. But Horton moved with grim certainty. He pulled back the lid of another barrel, then another, each one the same. Flesh, more flesh, enough to feed a village, enough to prove the rumors true 100 times over. And yet, the Broussards had vanished. Not a soul inside, not a whisper of movement. Beds empty, fire still warm. It was as if the family knew they were coming and melted into the swamp like smoke. But what they left behind was worse than their presence. Horton discovered a small chest in the corner of the cabin. Inside were relics. Buttons, locks of hair tied in ribbon, a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, a row of teeth strung together like beads, and scraps of paper, crude drawings in charcoal, figures bound, figures hanging, figures butchered. Not art, instruction, ritual, a handbook for silence. The sheriff shut the chest and ordered it burned, but Horton protested. He believed the evidence must survive, that it must be shown to the world. Yet history records no trial, no public display, no arrests. The chest vanished, just as the family did, consumed not by fire but by fear. What does that tell you? That the town did not want justice. They wanted distance. They wanted to bury the truth, deeper than the bodies in the swamp. For to admit it fully would mean admitting their silence had fed the Broussards for decades, and that was a weight too heavy for their consciences to bear. So the raid ended in half measure. Proof found, no arrests, no trial, no closure. The family gone, their system intact, their silence spreading. But listen carefully, because this is the most important part. After that night, disappearances did not stop. They slowed, yes. They shifted, yes. But they did not stop. Families still vanished on back roads, travelers still left wagons behind, and whispers still traced back to the swamp. The Broussards had not been destroyed. They had scattered. Some say they moved deeper into the bayou, splitting into smaller groups. Others claim they blended into nearby towns, their bloodlines hiding in plain sight. But Horton believed something darker. In his final notes, never published but passed in fragments, he suggested the raid was not a failure. It was an initiation. That the men who saw the barrels, who smelled the salted flesh, who felt the eyes in the trees, they became marked. Witnesses bound by silence. For once you have seen such horror, you cannot return to the world of the ordinary. You carry it. You protect it. You become it. And here is where the story shifts from past to present. Because if Horton was right, then silence itself is not absence. It is infection. A disease passed through sight, through knowledge. Once you see the system, once you taste the truth, you are infected with the duty to protect it, or to expose it. And most men, history shows, choose silence. Now ask yourself, when you hear this story, what choice do you make? Do you expose it, share it, spread it, refuse to let the silence grow? Or do you close the window, turn off the screen, bury the unease, and let the Broussards live again through your refusal to act? That is the true feast. Not flesh, not salt, not blood. Silence. And you are the next course. What happens when a monster is wounded but not killed? It does not vanish. It changes. It adapts. It hides deeper, learns patience, and waits for hunger to return. After the raid of 1905, the Broussard cabins stood empty, abandoned, already sagging into the mud. The barrels were burned, the shallow pits covered. The sheriff's men swore never to speak of what they had seen. Officially, the case was closed. Officially, there never had been a case at all. But disappearances continued, not in the same numbers, not with the same boldness, but in quieter patterns. A trapper gone missing here. A fisherman never returning there. A family cart found overturned on a side trail with no footprints leaving the scene. The Broussards had not been destroyed. They had scattered. And when a family like that scatters, it does not dissolve, it multiplies. Small groups moving further into the bayou, deeper into the cypress maze, where no lawman dared to follow. Children growing into adults, adults breeding more children, bloodlines folding back upon themselves. Silence carried not just as habit but as heritage. Think of seeds cast into soil. The raid was not an ending but a harvest. The Broussards became dozens of smaller roots, each digging into new ground unseen, feeding off darkness. And this is where the story turns from history to nightmare. Because once a system adapts, it becomes harder to see, harder to name. Gone were the visible cabins, the clustered homestead, the barrels stacked openly. In their place were hidden lean-tos, stilted huts deep in the swamp, camps that could be dismantled overnight. No evidence left behind but footprints in the mud, already washed away by rain. Father Horton kept searching. Against the wishes of the sheriff, against the exhaustion of his own spirit, he pressed deeper into the swamp. His letters became more erratic. He wrote of hearing laughter. In the reeds at night, children's laughter, though no children were there. He described seeing fires far off in the fog, only for them to vanish the moment he drew closer. Once, he claimed, he awoke from sleep to find a crude figure carved of cypress wood hanging from a tree above his camp. The figure had no eyes, only a mouth cut wide, filled with sharpened human teeth. Horton sent these letters to colleagues in New Orleans. None of them replied. By 1907, he vanished. His horse was found tied near the swamp's edge. His satchel, his Bible, his lantern, all resting neatly by the trail. His body was never recovered. Some say the Broussards finally took him. Others say he walked willingly into their ranks, infected by the silence he had studied too long. But the truth is simpler. The swamp consumed him, just as it had consumed countless others, and that silence spread. Now imagine the children of the Broussards, raised in fragments across the bayou. Some too young to remember the raid. Others, scarred by it, told stories of the night outsiders came to burn their home, to destroy their way of life. Imagine the resentment, the rage, the vow of survival whispered over salted flesh in the dark. Do you think those children would grow into harmless fishermen, quiet farmers? No. They grew into hunters, into teachers of silence, into parents who raised their own children with the same doctrine. Outsiders are prey. Flesh is inheritance. Secrecy is survival. The family line folded again and again. Blood thickened with repetition, and the swamp protected them. No census reached that far. No priest dared step onto their trails. No sheriff risked another raid. The Broussards became whispers again, perfectly invisible. But here's the question that gnaws like teeth in the dark. Did they stay in the swamp, or did they move among us? Because by the 1920s, disappearances were not just rural. Newspapers recorded strange vanishings in towns near the bayou. Families gone from their homes overnight, children lost on their way to school, hunters disappearing with their dogs, always without struggle, always without trace. And in those same years, children appeared in orphanages across Louisiana. Children with strange accents, strange eyes, who did not speak for months. Children who preferred raw meat, who refused to pray, who stared too long at their caretakers without blinking. Some of those children were adopted into ordinary families. Their names changed, their silence remained. Think about that. If even a handful of Broussard children escaped into the wider world, their blood runs through veins that may sit beside you today, in schools, in offices, in churches. The swamp may be far behind them, but silence is hereditary. Silence travels, silence survives. And that is why history books never mention them, because if they did, you might begin to ask questions. You might begin to wonder who else carries that inheritance, that appetite, that ability to hide. But let's push further. The Broussards were not simply a family, they were a template, a demonstration of how a hidden system can feed on outsiders while remaining untouchable, how fear, complicity, and silence protect predators better than any wall or weapon. Tell me, do you not see that template alive today? Corporations that devour entire communities, yet survive, because no one dares to speak. Politicians who vanish scandals into silence while the public looks away. Families with bloodlines so entangled with wealth and secrecy that their rituals never come to light. The Broussards were not destroyed. They were absorbed. Their method became the world's method. Their silence became your silence. And if you think this is only history, then listen carefully. There are still roads near the bayou where travelers disappear. There are still reports of barrels found half buried in mud, their lids sealed tight. There are still children in towns who laugh too softly, who stare too long, who whisper in languages no one else understands. Do you really think they're gone? Or have you simply learned, like the townspeople of 1905, that silence is easier than truth? So I ask you again, will you break silence, or will you feed it? Because every time you scroll past a truth too heavy, every time you dismiss the unease gnawing at you, every time you convince yourself that horror is only legend, you salt the flesh, you turn the barrel, you become the Broussards' legacy. And that is the infection. It is not their blood in your veins. It is their silence in your soul. By the middle of the 20th century, the Broussards should have been nothing more than folklore, a cautionary tale muttered in Cajun French, a ghost story told to keep children from wandering too far into the cypress woods. But legends don't survive this long without roots. Something kept feeding the story. Something kept it alive. In 1942, a fisherman named Leon Boudreau reported finding a barrel washed up along a bend of the bayou. It was waterlogged, swollen, sealed with rusted iron bands. He pried it open, expecting spoiled fish or brined pork. What he found was pale, bloated flesh, the skin stretched and grey from salt and water. He said nothing at first, until the smell carried into town, and the sheriff demanded an explanation. The sheriff wrote it off as animal remains, but Boudreau swore to his dying day that it was human. He claimed he saw a hand small as a child's curled inside the brine. His story was ridiculed, dismissed, but it kept the whispers alive. Then, in 1957, two brothers hunting ducks near Atchafalaya reported hearing a chorus of children singing in the fog. High voices, wordless, rising and falling in eerie unison. They followed the sound to a clearing and found nothing. No prints, no voices, only a crude doll of twigs and bone hanging from a tree branch, swaying without wind. Local papers mocked them, calling it swamp madness, but the hunters refused to enter the bayou again. These are not isolated accounts. In the 1970s, workers dredging part of the swamp for an oil company unearthed a cluster of bones. Dozens, some animal, some human, tangled together, buried shallow under mud and root. The company quickly shut down that dig, calling it an unmarked gravesite. The bones were reburied, no further investigation conducted, but one worker confessed to a priest that he'd seen small skulls among the pile, children's skulls, brittle and cracked, teeth still set in place. And then the sightings began to spread beyond the swamp. By the 1980s, strange reports trickled in from towns as far as Lafayette and Baton Rouge. Families claimed to see ragged figures watching from tree lines at night. Police were called to investigate barns broken into, not for money, not for tools, but for meat. Slabs of beef stripped from hooks, livestock gutted but not stolen, as if someone, or something, was sampling, not stealing. And always the same whisper followed: the Broussards. By then the name had become a curse word, a way to explain anything wrong, anything missing, anything strange. Parents warned children, "Don't wander at night, or the Broussards will take you." Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the swamp, to leave offerings of raw meat on tree stumps. Some swore the offerings vanished by morning. But here's where it gets darker. In 1993, a hurricane tore through Louisiana, flooding parts of the Atchafalaya Basin. Rescue workers searching for survivors stumbled upon a cluster of shacks on stilts, half submerged, deep in an area no one thought was inhabited. Inside they found belongings scattered: clothes, tools, cooking pots, and meat, salted, dried, hanging from rafters. Human or animal, no one could say. The report never reached the public. But whispers spread among the rescuers. They had found one of the Broussard nests, and whoever lived there had fled before the storm hit. Fled where? That question still echoes. Some say descendants moved deeper into the swamp, surviving in isolated bands, still feeding the cycle. Others insist they left the swamp entirely, blending into ordinary society. Imagine that. Descendants with new names, new clothes, working jobs, living lives, all while carrying a bloodline built on flesh and silence. Can you prove they aren't your neighbors? There are even those who claim the Broussards never saw themselves as criminals or monsters. They believed they were chosen, set apart from the rest of the world. To them, eating flesh wasn't horror, it was inheritance, a ritual of survival, a sacrament. And rituals don't vanish, they evolve, they adapt. They wait. Now listen closely, because this is where the story crosses into the present, into your world. In 2003, hikers found another barrel, this time sealed tight, hidden under brush near an abandoned trapper's shack. Photographs leaked online before authorities confiscated them. The images showed salt-white flesh, hair still attached to the scalp, fingers curled in unnatural angles. Officials dismissed it as a hoax. But if it was a hoax, why confiscate the evidence? Why erase the reports from archives? Why silence the hikers who discovered it? Silence. Always silence. And that silence is what keeps the Broussards alive. You may laugh, dismiss this as folklore, as hysteria. But ask yourself, how many legends persist without fuel? How many families vanish without cause? How many bones are buried under swamp soil, never to be counted, never to be named? The Broussards are not just history, they are a pattern, a blueprint, a shadow system that thrives on fear, secrecy, and denial. They do not need to reveal themselves, they only need you to look away, to scroll past, to tell yourself it isn't real, and in that moment, the silence feeds them again. Perhaps you will say, "It's only Louisiana, it's only the swamp, I am safe." But hunger does not know borders. Silence does not stop at state lines. If even a fraction of the Broussards' descendants escaped the raid of 1905, their bloodline could be anywhere by now. Cities, suburbs, small towns, even your own street. Imagine a family that still gathers in secret, not around a table of turkey and ham, but around salted flesh. whispering prayers not of grace, but of inheritance, teaching children not just to eat, but to remember, to carry the silence. Do you think such families could not exist in the modern world, that they would be caught, exposed, destroyed? Then, you have forgotten the lesson of the raid. Exposure is never destruction. Exposure is initiation. And now you are initiated, because hearing this, knowing this, you are no longer outside the silence. You are inside it. You carry it now. You cannot say you were never told. So the question becomes, what will you do with it? Will you spread it, share it, shine light where generations have kept darkness? Or will you close this window, dismiss this story, and let silence grow stronger? The Broussards survive either way, but only one path makes you complicit. The other makes you dangerous. They say the past never really stays buried, that the ground itself remembers, and if you want proof, all you have to do is read between the lines of modern police reports. Consider 2007. In Rapides Parish, Louisiana, a young couple disappeared while driving home from a wedding. Their car was found the next morning, doors unlocked, valuables untouched, gas tank half full. The strange part, the driver's seat was pushed far forward, as if a much smaller person had taken the wheel. Investigators searched the woods nearby and found footprints, dozens of them, weaving in chaotic circles, barefoot, small, uneven, as if belonging to children. But there were no children within 50 miles of the site. The report concluded, unknown persons responsible. The case remains open. 2 years later, in 2009, hunters camping along the Calcasieu River claimed they were stalked for 3 nights straight. They described hearing whispers, low, guttural French, circling their camp. On the final night, one of their hounds was taken. Not killed. Taken. The hunters found the animal's chain snapped, paw prints scuffed into the dirt, and droplets of blood leading into the swamp. They followed the trail until the brush grew too thick, but one detail froze them in place. The paw prints stopped abruptly, as if the dog had been lifted and carried away. Do you see the pattern? The vanishings never ended. They evolved. They modernized. In 2013, 3 college students disappeared while filming an amateur documentary about Louisiana legends. They told friends they were going off-grid for a weekend to explore old swamp settlements. Their last footage, recovered from a water-damaged camera, shows the 3 walking through fog, laughing nervously, when a 4th voice cuts in, low, commanding, speaking French no one has yet been able to fully translate. The screen tilts violently, and then nothing. Their eyes were never found. The footage was dismissed by authorities as tampered evidence, but leaked clips surface online every few years, usually pulled down within days. The story goes viral, dies, resurfaces, dies again, almost as if someone wants the memory to survive, without ever being fully proven. That is the Broussard signature: presence without proof, silence instead of answers, whispers instead of testimony. And maybe you're thinking, but this could be anyone. Cults exist everywhere. Why pin it on the Broussards? Because of the details. The whispers in French, the salt barrels, the mutilated livestock, the silence after each disappearance, always the same patterns repeating like a family ritual, always circling back to the swamps of Louisiana. But here is the truth you aren't supposed to ask. What if they left Louisiana long ago? In 2016, a case in Arkansas caught my attention. A family of 5 vanished from their farmhouse in a single night. Dinner was still on the table, chairs pulled out, television humming in the background. Their neighbors swore they saw figures moving along the tree line in the days before, figures too many in number, too disciplined to be thieves. When police searched the area, they found animal carcasses hanging from branches, stripped clean of flesh. The official report never used the word ritual, but the silence says more than ink ever could. Now consider this. Every society, every city, every town has missing persons cases that go unsolved. We're told it's crime, runaways, bad luck. But what if even 1% of those vanishings tie back to something older, something hereditary, something like the Broussards, families within families bound by silence, practicing rituals in plain sight? What if they are hiding where you'd never expect them, among us? Think about the neighbor who never waves, the family at the end of the street who never quite blends in, The quiet clan that keeps to themselves, never hosting barbecues, never attending church. You tell yourself they're private. But what if privacy is camouflage? What if their silence isn't shyness but training? Remember what Father Horton said over a century ago. The Broussard children moved like soldiers. They were drilled, disciplined, conditioned. Do you think that kind of training disappears in a generation? Or do you think it gets passed down, perfected, refined, until it blends seamlessly into suburban streets and modern schools? And here's the question you should be asking. Are they waiting for something? Because rituals are never random. They are cycles, phases, seasons. The Broussards disappeared after 1905, not because they were destroyed, but because they were patient. They knew silence is stronger than violence. Silence lets you survive. Silence lets you wait. Wait for what? Perhaps for the right moment. A collapse, a famine, a war, a disaster that strips society down and leaves the isolated strong again. Think about it. How many of your neighbors would know how to survive without a grocery store, without electricity, without order? The Broussards wouldn't just survive, they would thrive. And here is the part you must hear, the part that shifts this story from curiosity into initiation. You cannot prove they are gone. Every barrel found, every bone unearthed, every whisper caught on tape is a reminder. Not evidence, not closure, a reminder. That's the genius of a family like the Broussards. They don't have to exist everywhere. They only have to exist somewhere. And the fear does the rest. The silence spreads like rot through wood. You don't need proof to feel it. You feel it now, don't you? That pressure at the back of your neck, that thought that maybe you've looked away too quickly from strange, as in your own town. You're starting to understand. And once you understand, you can't go back. Now, before we go deeper, write this in the comments twice, exactly as you see it. I break the silence. Do it twice. Because by doing it, you're declaring you won't be the one who looks away. You won't feed them with silence. You'll stand outside the circle. Most won't. Most will dismiss this. But those who write it, they mark themselves. They step out of the fog and say, I see you. The Broussards thrive on the unseen, the unnamed, the unspoken. They rely on silence. But you can choose to break it. And once you break the silence, you can never belong to them. You have transformed. The question is, how many others will join you? Silence is not just the absence of sound, it's a weapon, a tool sharper than any blade, heavier than any hammer. The Broussards understood this instinctively, and that's why their legacy still clings to the world like swamp fog. Think of how silence works in families. A secret is born, an abuse, a betrayal, a ritual, and instead of speaking, everyone learns the same unspoken rule. We don't talk about it. Children are raised in that pressure, suffocated until silence feels natural. They grow up and pass it down. The silence becomes inheritance. That is the Broussard blueprint. You see, the act of eating human flesh was only half the ritual. The other half was silence. They weren't just teaching their children to consume. They were teaching them to conceal, to suppress, to endure the unbearable without words. The flesh rotted away, but the silence endured. And that silence is what makes them dangerous, because silence is not just a family trait. It is the architecture of power. Look at institutions, churches, governments, corporations. How do they survive scandal after scandal? How do they endure when evidence piles high? Silence. Strategic, orchestrated silence. It's not coincidence. It's the same psychology. Take the Catholic Church and its long-hidden abuses. Decades of priests shielded by silence, victims buried under shame, whispers traded behind locked doors. Or think of government cover-ups. Files sealed, witnesses silenced, entire events erased from public record. Each time, silence becomes the sacrament. The Broussards were not merely swamp cannibals. They were a mirror held up to the systems we all live under. They proved that silence itself can be ritual, that silence itself can be worship. And once you realize that, you begin to see the Broussards everywhere. Look at the family down your street. Do they never talk about their father's anger? That's silence. Look at the company executive who smiles through accusations, never breaking, never confessing. That's silence. Look at the way entire communities refuse to acknowledge they're dead, they're missing, they're exploited. That's silence. It's not just survival, it's power. But the Broussards refined it into something primal. They weren't bound by shame or fear. Their silence was deliberate, purposeful, almost holy. Imagine a family that never betrayed itself with gossip, with confession, with weakness. A family that spoke only when necessary, obeyed only the bloodline, and left no trace of evidence. That is why they outlasted lawmen, priests, and journalists. Not because they were invisible, but because they were inaudible. And here is the part that chills. Silence shapes the mind. Psychologists know this. Generations of silence warp a family's perception of reality. Secrets change memory. Ritual alters identity. By the third or fourth generation, children no longer see the ritual as wrong. They see it as normal, expected, sacred. The world outside becomes wrong, and their world, the blood, the flesh, the silence, becomes right. It's indoctrination, it's brainwashing. But when passed through enough generations, it no longer feels like brainwashing. It feels like blood, like destiny. That is why the Broussards are not ghosts. They are a system, and that system, if you look closely, exists far beyond Louisiana. Why do cults thrive? Because they teach silence. Why do fraternities endure scandals? Because they train silence. Why do powerful families survive collapse after collapse? Because silence is their armor. Do you see the connection? The Broussards may be folklore, but the machinery they embodied is everywhere. Every time you hear someone say, "Don't talk about that," "Don't bring it up," "Keep it in the family," you are hearing Broussard logic echo down the centuries. Now think of how silence feels in your own life. How many things have you swallowed rather than spoken? How many truths have you carried in your chest like stones, afraid to drop them into the water because of the ripple they'd make? That is how it begins. One silence becomes another, and another. And before you know it, you're part of the ritual too. You think this is a story about Louisiana cannibals, but it's also about you. Because you carry silence. We all do. And silence, when left unchecked, eats us alive. But the Broussards turned that decay into strength. They didn't run from silence, they harnessed it. And that is why their legend endures. Because every family that keeps a secret feeds their ghost. Every institution that hides its crimes resurrects their ritual. Every community that buries the truth strengthens their bloodline. So let's ask the darkest question of all. What if the Broussards never needed to survive as flesh and blood people? What if their survival lies in the silence itself? What if the Broussards are not a family but a pattern, a virus that infects every place where silence is stronger than truth? Look around, and you. Do you see how many places that pattern fits? Missing children, unsolved murders, churches with locked files, governments with sealed records, families that smile while their foundations rot. All of it, the same ritual, the same silence, the same inheritance, and maybe that is the real horror. Not that the Broussards are hiding in some swamp shack, salting flesh in barrels, but that they live through us every time we choose not to speak. Because silence is not neutral. Silence protects someone, always. Silence feeds someone, always. And maybe, just maybe, the Broussards survive in every silence that still grips the world. Now tell me, whose silence are you carrying? And more importantly, who does it protect? If you think the Broussards are unique, you haven't been paying attention. The hunger, the ritual, the silence, they echo across the world, across centuries, across cultures. Look to the Andes, 1972. A plane crashes in the mountains. Survivors, ordinary men, students, athletes, are forced to eat the dead to live. When they are rescued months later, they speak softly, carefully. They carry silence. Even decades on, many refuse to speak openly of what happened in that frozen cathedral. Survival required flesh, and silence protected them, or travel back to Europe's famines. Villages in Ireland, Russia, even medieval France whisper of starving times, when neighbors vanished and children were warned not to walk alone. Officials called it folklore. Survivors called it necessity. The dead weren't buried, they were consumed. And afterward? Silence. Always silence. In Japan there are tales of the Macabre, mountain witches who lured travelers into huts and fed on them in secret. In the Arctic, the Inuit tell of the Kalapiluit, creatures who snatch children and drag them beneath the ice. In Haiti, whispers of zombification blur into ritual cannibalism, a way to bind the spirit and the flesh together. Different lands, different names, same rhythm, hunger, ritual, silence. And closer to America, the native tribes told stories of the Wendigo, a spirit of famine, hunger incarnate. To speak of it was to risk inviting it, so silence became protection. But silence also let the fear grow. The Wendigo was not a creature you could kill. It was a curse, a pattern, a sickness that survived wherever hunger met desperation. Sound familiar? The Broussards weren't inventing something new. They were inheriting an ancient cycle. They were proof that hunger doesn't just live in the body. It lives in the bloodline. It adapts, evolves, changes costume, but never dies. And if that's true, then the Broussards were not the end of a story. They were simply one verse in a song the world has been singing forever. So here is the terrifying possibility. There are other Broussards, other families, other bloodlines that built their identity on flesh and silence, then disappeared into the cracks of history. Maybe in South America, maybe in Asia, maybe next door. And what binds them together is not just what they ate, it's what they refused to say. Because silence is the bridge, silence is the bloodstream, silence is the glue that keeps ritual alive across centuries. Think about it. How many legends sound exactly like the Broussards if you strip them of their names? Families who vanish, strangers who steal livestock, communities that survive disaster by doing the unthinkable, then swearing never to speak of it again. It's everywhere, everywhere. And here is where it gets darker still. Silence is contagious. When one person refuses to speak, others copy. Shame breeds shame. Fear breeds fear. Soon an entire community can be complicit in silence without ever holding a council, without ever signing an oath. It just spreads, like a virus, like a curse. That's why the Broussards endure, not because they're supernatural, not because they're immortal, but because their ritual is viral. Their silence infects anyone who hears their story and refuses to speak it aloud. Now ask yourself, are you infected already? You heard this story. You felt the chill. And what did you do? Did you share it, speak it, repeat it? Or did you hold it in, close your screen, and tell yourself you'll forget? That choice is the ritual. That choice is the infection. That choice is what determines whether the Broussards live or die. Because they do not live in swamps anymore. They live in silence. And silence, my friend, is everywhere. This is the part of the story you weren't meant to hear. This is the part where the legend stops being a legend and starts being a mirror. Look around you. Every house with locked doors, every neighbor who never speaks, every missing poster stapled to a lamppost, every case that goes unsolved. How much of it is chance, and how much of it is ritual silence repeating itself? The Broussards don't need to be hiding in Louisiana. They could be anywhere silence is stronger than truth. Anywhere fear is stronger than voice. Anywhere people choose to look away rather than look closer. That means the Broussards could be in the woods, the city, the farmhouse, the apartment upstairs. They could be in the family across the street, the quiet co-workers, the strange couple on the bus. They could be in your own bloodline, because hunger is human, silence is human, and that means the Broussards were never just them. They were always us. And here is the final truth. Once you know the silence, you can't escape it. You've carried it through this entire story. It's with you now. The only question left is, will you keep it, or will you break it? Will you whisper the legend to someone else, keep the fire alive, spread the silence by passing it as shadow? Or will you speak it out loud, pull it into the open, cut through the silence with the blade of your voice? That choice is yours. But know this, the Broussards are listening. Every time you fall silent, they feed. Every time you refuse to share, they grow stronger. And if you think they cannot reach you, that they are gone, that this is nothing more than story, go ahead. Turn off this video, step into the darkened hallway, walk past your mirror without looking, lay down in your bed and let the silence settle. See what comes for you in the quiet. Because silence is not empty, silence is full of teeth.